My name is Eliud Polanco, and I'm the president at Fluree. Today, we're going to be talking about the subject of model, map, and connect, which is a framework for how to create rich semantic data. And the first thing we're going to talk about is, well, why is it important to even talk about semantic data, and what does that even mean? After we discuss this, we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges in creating semantic data, but then introduce model, map, and connect, which is a framework for how we're going to be able to take legacy relational information and convert it to these new rich semantic data formats. We'll go through a specific use case example, and then we're going to walk through how the Fluree product suite has been organized around this framework to facilitate the process of creating rich semantic data at very large scale. And then finally, we'll give some practical ideas around how to get started within your organization. Let's start first with the discussion around why should we even be talking about semantic data? And we'll talk about why semantic data matters and what it means. And first, we're going to start by talking about how is data being used today, and what are some of the major trends that we've been seeing in the patterns for how organizations and enterprises are using data. And the very first trend is, I'm pretty sure that like many organizations, we've all been interested in the topic of generative AI and large language models and looking at how things like ChatGPT and Gemini and Llama 2 are creating new, rich ways of interacting with data. And right now, I'm sure it's the topic of conversation in every enterprise board level meeting. What are companies doing with generative AI? And so what we're starting to see is some really interesting use cases around using generative AI to support new customer sales and service, operational optimization, ways to share knowledge and information internally within the organization. And a lot of the really kind of enterprise and innovative use cases are really based on having a deep, rich understanding of a company's financials, their employees, their business processes, so that you can ask some really interesting questions like, ChatGPT, pretend that you're a business consultant. Can you help me identify what are the top 5 initiatives that I should undertake to increase customer retention by 14%? And then have these large language models scale the breadth of the enterprise information to try to construct a response to those questions. So we're seeing that there's lots of new rich opportunities to interact and engage with data just through large language models and generative AI that weren't possible even a year ago. The other major big trend that's happened over the last 6 months in particular was after COVID, it became pretty obvious that if you were just using your own data, that you may not have a full and complete picture of the information that you need to run your operations. And it turns out that we are heavily dependent on our supply chain partners, and we're dependent on peers, and in many cases, even understanding the information that's happening with vendors and competitors. And so in this case, there's a real need and a desire to be able to share and collect and integrate information from across the ecosystem, whether these are partners in your ecosystem that are internal to your company. So looking at some new interesting use cases around sharing data internally just to get a better understanding of the customer, of your product, of your supply chain, as well as looking at information with partners and with suppliers outside of the company. Now, what's very interesting about these broad new use cases is that they all have something in common, which is that they're all heavily dependent on making data available and accessible by parties that did not create or originally define the data. What this means is that data has to be understandable now to machines and programmatic logic and intelligent agents, as well as to different teams and partners inside and outside of your company. When we talk about making data understandable, what do we actually mean by this? And it helps if we look at a specific example. So this is structured data, or data that is saved in a typical relational format. And when we say a structured or relational data format, we mean data as you'd expect to see in a spreadsheet with rows and columns. And the challenge with typical relational data, what we call legacy data, has been that it was designed, built, and saved in a format that is efficient for the business application that's creating it or primarily consuming it. What this means is that this specific table makes a lot of sense to the application that created it, but it's not really usable unless you understand the specific codes and the application logic of the business application that created it. If we were to ask you, well, what is this data table describing? Unless you're a consumer of the application, it's going to be very difficult to use this data as it is. Now, if I told you that this specific code is actually representing a column that contains industry sector codes, and then this specific MECH label is actually a tag or is basically a symbolic reference to something that represents an industry sector called mechanical engineering, or that this specific code, HILB, is a system code for semi-finished products, now we're working towards making the data a little bit more understandable outside of the context of the original application that created it. In essence, what we're doing is we are adding semantics to the data. Now, this is what the same data table looks like, but after we've converted it to something that's a little bit easier to understand. Now we can come back and say, okay, I understand the context of this specific data table. We're talking about engineering materials, which are components that are rolling up to products that are not yet fully finished or ready to go to market. And by the way, this information was also telling me that I have a lot of these components currently in stock. This information is something that we can now feed either to different partners, suppliers, or to different intelligent agents and large language models to now go back and reuse and see if we can generate some new insights. Now, this is not a relatively new problem. This is a well-understood, well-tread problem. And the way that we've typically tried to solve this is we typically go through a process of taking the original data in its original form and then transforming it and converting it to new forms. And the way that we did this historically was through a process called ETL, or extract, transform, and load. And most organizations have a data management architecture pattern that looks like this picture. In this picture, we have a business application. And as we just described, the business application has a set of logic that creates data. And the data is saved in a format that is optimal for the logic that created it. And many applications will contain programmable interfaces or APIs that will allow other business applications to be able to connect to it. And so here we can see how two different business applications can talk to each other via an API. However, the information that's saved inside these various different application databases has been designed for the optimal use of one consumer, which is the application logic. And it doesn't facilitate or doesn't help us with the use cases that require data to be consumed by either machines or teams or partners beyond the original creator of the data. And so what tended to happen is we've created over many years of time this integration layer where we take data, we extract it from its source, we transform it, meaning we copy it or we change it into some kind of a version that's easier for a consumer to understand, and then we load it into some kind of copy location. In some cases, we're taking the data and moving it into an operational store. In some cases, we're putting it in a data warehouse or a data lake. And once it's inside a data warehouse or a data lake, we may take the data and further transform it and create more copies. Now, the challenge with this pattern has been that over time, you wind up creating way too many copies of data, and it becomes very difficult to figure out what's the truth. Like, where is the information that I'm supposed to be using that's authoritative? When we don't have a source of truth and we don't know exactly where to find something, then we start losing trust on the data itself. The other challenge that we've seen is that there is very often not a common way in which we're describing things. And each time a brand new end user requires the information, the data gets transformed in a way or a method that makes sense of that user. And as a result, we now have not only lots of copies, but we also have lots of transformations, lots of different ways of describing the same bit of information. These are the kinds of symptoms that have made sharing data in these new emergent use cases very complex. And as a result, it's not easy to take traditional data and share it with a large language model, or take data and share it with our partners or teams. It typically takes a very extensive data management and integration investment in order to do so. The new pattern that is emerging to help ease some of these issues and facilitate some of these new emergent use cases is using semantics, and specifically a term called the semantic data fabric. In a semantic data fabric, the focus is not necessarily on moving and copying data from one location to another, but basically creating one big large index that allows me to understand what data I have, map it under an abstracted layer of a kind of a set of business vocabularies and glossaries and terms that end users can understand, correlate the various different databases from a business perspective to a technical perspective and link them together, and then save all this information, all this metadata, this rich metadata, save it inside a knowledge graph. And then a knowledge graph enables you to connect the dots and set it up so that instead of each application having to have a separate API or having to copy or move data for other people to use it, we can interact with the semantic layer itself and then use this as a bridge or a broker to go and connect to the information at the various different ends. The beauty of this is that in this pattern, the functions are coming to the data as opposed to the data being copied and pushed out to each business application or each business function that needs it. And in this case, what we're doing is we're reducing the copies of data, and instead we're linking and connecting information from across the systems such that we can now create a single interface that we can use to share information with our partners or with the intelligent agents and large language models. Rather than having to create a copy of the data that's specific for an LLM, we can just teach the LLMs how to read the data from the semantic layer and pull the information that they need. As you can see, a lot of these patterns are based on having a fundamental concept of semantic modeling, which is a way to make data understandable by describing data using business terminology or terms that end users are going to understand, instead of using terms that the application schemas are designed to understand. And very simply, when we talk about semantic modeling, all we are is talking about defining a set of classes or types of things, and then describing the properties or the attributes of things, and then describing constraints around things or relationships between things. Just to give an example here, we can describe that a customer is a type of entity, that a customer has various different properties like a name and an ID, that a customer is related to a class called product, and it's related because a customer purchases a product. And by the way, we can create or establish a constraint that says, by definition, a customer is a customer because they have purchased a product. And so when we save the data this way, this is much more easy and understandable if we're going to be sharing data or information across teams, partners, or intelligent agents, because not only are we describing what everything is, we're also describing how everything is naturally related to everything else. It's a very easy way to understand and interpret information that could be very rich and very complex. Now, what's very interesting is that a lot of the standards and a lot of the best practices around how to create and model and manage and maintain semantic data are not necessarily new. So we've given a couple of examples here of different open source community-driven standards around creating and saving data in a semantic way such that different machines and users can interact with it. Things like RDF, or the Resource Definition Framework, the Web Ontology Language, or OWL, or JSON linked data have been around for at least 15 years. And then the way that the system that interacts with most of these standards are called knowledge graph databases as opposed to traditional relational databases. And knowledge graph databases have also been around for about 15 or 20 years. So the technology and what we're looking at here and the standards for how to manage and write semantic data is not new. It's been around for a very long time. It's just been that the use cases that are demanding or requiring the need for them have really changed over the past year in particular, where we're starting to see that not having the data in a rich semantic format is going to inhibit you from being able to execute or achieve some of the critical success objectives of these use cases. Now, one of the challenges that we have is that we've been operating in a relational world for the past 40 years, and even though semantics is about 20 years old, there's been very few people, or there's very few kind of skills or resources inside most companies to actually live and manage and even think in a semantic way. In the relational world, we tend to think about things in the context of tables and databases and rows and columns. And we tend to think about linking and connecting different database tables together using joins. But those ideas or concepts are very different in a semantic world. There are no spreadsheets, there are no rows and columns. Instead, we tend to think about the world as classes and properties and triples. And we don't join information, we just establish relationships. And what we found in many organizations is that people that understand the relational world have a really hard time immediately adapting themselves to the semantic world because it's so vastly different from a traditional relational way of thinking about the world. We've seen in most organizations, for every one person that understands the semantic world of classes and properties and ontologies, there's at least 50x people, 50 times the volume of people that understand data in a more traditional relational structure. And that's always been a traditional challenge in terms of why is it so hard to migrate data from the relational structures to these new rich semantic formats, even though the standards are 20 years old. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a framework, and this framework called Model, Map, and Connect is a way to help us work through the problems of how do we take a lot of the relational data that we've been building and creating for the last 40 years. How do we take this information? How do we start to migrate it into these rich semantic forms with an understanding that the skills and the resources for most of the people that need to execute the framework are going to come from a traditional relational background. Now, when we're talking about this framework for model, map, and connect, let's actually define what each of the 3 steps means. So the very first step is called model. And model is simply put, let's just define your data dictionary or your vocabulary. Build your ontology or build your taxonomy. Describe the world the way you want to be able to relate to things that matter or are of importance to you. The second step is going to be map. Map is basically to overlay the existing data that exists today, overlay the model on top of it, or map the data to the model so that we can now start to represent the information using the model as opposed to the traditional way that it was originally written and saved in. And the third step is going to be to connect. When we connect, we're bringing all of the mapping information into a knowledge graph, and we're also setting the secure permissions and policies so that we can really control and understand who's supposed to get access to what information. And the beautiful thing about how we define the contract for how we manage who's allowed to access or view data once we've connected it, it's all based on the various different properties that you've described in your model. So let's say that in your model, you describe that you have HR managers and you have employees and you have a thing called compensation, and compensation includes salary plus benefits, and you describe your benefits as having life insurance policy or retirement policy, work from home policy, etc. You can establish an access control policy that will say only HR managers of a certain title, a certain job title, at a certain seniority level are allowed to see employee compensation information. And because you've described your model and you've mapped your data to that model, now we can establish and define a contract using that same exact model so that we can control who has access to the information once we've connected it or bridged it all together. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at a specific use case around how do we actually deploy model, map, and connect in a real-world environment. But one of the critical things that we're going to need to address is that we've spent the last 30, 40 years creating volumes of data in these legacy formats. And in order for us to quickly, at scale, bring this data into a rich semantic format, we're going to need to use machine power. We're going to need to leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence to help us along the way. In the modeling step, what we're going to find is that as we start mapping data to the model, we're going to continuously be refining our understanding of what the model is going to be. And we want machine assistance to help us say, okay, I describe these specific terms and I describe these values in my model, but based on looking at the data, I could be describing richer terms or different terms that will help me really describe the totality of my universe. And so having machine assistance will help in defining a richer model upfront. The mapping process itself is has to be, by definition, a machine-assisted process to go through and scan all of the vast stories of data that you have in order to help identify and make recommendations on how do we find the right classes and properties from our model to then overlay and map on top of our existing data. And then finally, once we've been able to connect the information, we can then unleash AI to help us find new insights. And this is where we really want to get to, where we're able to have analytics sitting on top of data that's being shared by partners or with suppliers, or information that's being passed through large language models to answer some of these really interesting new generative AI questions. But in order to do this, we have to complete the modeling and the mapping first. For today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a scenario for integrating pharmaceutical data. And this will be kind of a generic pharmaceutical company that develops pharmaceutical or medicinal drugs. In this case, you're seeing here the typical value chain where you start designing drugs and you register chemical compounds and then you test samples. When you start to see promising candidates for a new pharmaceutical product, we then have to go through and submit the clinical trial results to various different regulatory agencies to get their approvals. Once they get the approvals, we can then start to manufacture the products and then take it to market. And your specific industry or your value chain may be different, but what they all have in common is that at each step of the way, each of the different processes in the value chain is generating a lot of information. And all this information is being stored in many databases. And these databases could be very complex, and they could be saving the data in lots of different schemas or tables, but it's all dependent on the business application and how that application is saving the data so that it can facilitate its leg of the process. Now, ideally, what we'd like to do is we'd like to be able to take the information spread out across all these stores of information and bring it into a common knowledge fabric. And the idea here is we're not physically moving data out of all these sources and copying it or transforming it and loading it into a separate location. But we want to be able to connect the dots, and we want to be able to locate and find information semantically. Now, in this case, we're going to start using some industry ontologies or industry glossaries to be able to enable us to connect the information across various different sources. So let's say in the pharmaceutical industry, there are quite a few different industry ontologies. There's IDMPO for drug identification. So that's the identification of medicinal products ontology. There's a different ontology just for describing the results of lab analytic processes. So maybe the data in your sample management and testing could be described using something like allotrope. When you get into the product manufacturing side, there's another ontology that just focuses on batches and batch control. And so you might have a lot of your ERP data could be something that could be more easily described if you use a common business ontology for managing lots and batches. But our vision is that if we're able to connect this information and then overlay these various different models on top of the existing data, we can then open up and exploit a lot of this information for many different use cases. So we can use it from the left of the value chain, which is focused on how do we accelerate the design and the discovery of new drugs, all the way to how do we make the process of submitting the drugs for regulatory approval faster, to how do we improve the efficiency of the manufacturing process, and how do we make it easier for us to get drugs faster to market. So all these different use cases are now opened up and available to us by being able to link and interconnect this information and using various different ontologies as a vehicle for all these different end users to be able to talk to each other and understand what the data means. Now, it can feel a little bit overwhelming when you're starting from a blank slate of lots of different systems and lots of different schemas. And so our recommendation, when we're going to kind of walk through this use case, we're going to start with step 0, which is, well, let's just pick one use case. And we're going to have the big picture in mind, but we're going to start very tactically. So in this example, we're going to focus on one use case, which is regulatory submission optimization. How do we make it easier for us to collect the information that's necessary for us to do our regulatory filings so that we can hopefully get our drugs through the approval process much faster? And we've identified for this specific use case, we're going to identify a specific ontology. So this ontology, IDMP, happens to be a really good one that describes the subjects and the nouns and the entities that we need that are going to ultimately make it faster for us to submit the paperwork to get regulatory approval. Now, even though we've kind of selected our use case and we've selected our ontology, we still want to focus on a very small portion of that ontology. So we're going to start with a specific domain within that ontology. And we're just going to, which is basically just a small sub piece of the ontology, just the least amount that we need to get started. And what we're then going to do is we're going to take that domain and we're going to start breaking apart what are the specific classes and properties and relationships that we care about. Over here on this screen, you can see that this is an example of what it looks like to model a specific concept. And in a concept, you're going to have a name, a definition. You may have synonyms for your concept. You may have different ways to describe that concept across multiple languages. But what's going to be very critical is that each unique concept or each idea or thematic element of your ontology is going to be given a unique identifier, a unique ID. And that's important because what this will allow us to do is if we can link or associate your data to that ID, you can carry and inherit all of this knowledge associated to this concept back to that specific term that's linked to it. So let's say that in our example, we're going to focus on a specific domain called a substance. And right now, we're just going to decompose substance, and we're going to say, okay, a substance has certain properties, but then the properties of the substance have relationship to other classes. So in this case, we can say that a substance has a moiety, and a substance has an amount. And then these things, moiety and amount, they themselves have their own properties. And so what we do is we define a portion of the model that's well enough for us to get started. And it doesn't have to be 100% comprehensive, just good enough for us to get started. What we're going to find when we define these models is that not only are we going to define classes and properties, but we're also going to define a set of enumerated valid values. So for example, we may come back and say, look, substances must be defined. We're going to create a constraint that a substance must be defined as being a chemical or a mixture or nucleic acid. And these terms are important because they mean something. If you're nucleic acid, then this opens up a bunch of other additional knowledge that we can use and link in our ontology around nucleic acids. As you mentioned before, the key theme behind this semantic model is that every unique idea in your semantic model is going to have a unique ID. And in this case, this is an ID that is going to be discoverable or reusable by any machine or person. So when we describe the term substance, we're going to create this unique ID substance. If I have a piece of data and I want to say that this data is a substance, all I need to do is I just need to assign that data this specific ID and say that that data is an instance of this IRI, or this International Resource Identifier. And that's how we're going to start converting this kind of conceptual model into something tangible and something real. Step 2 is where we're going to now start to map data onto the model. And we're going to deconstruct this into 2 different steps. There's a step 2A, which is going to focus on structured data. And we're also going to briefly touch in step 2b on unstructured data. In this case, when we're starting with 2a, which is for structured data, what we want to do is we want to start identifying just a few example cases of where do I know that I have substance data. So we'll pick our domain, and then we're going to say, okay, I know for a fact that I've got a few sources of information that contain substance data. I'm going to use that as our training set. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's extrapolate or let's generalize the knowledge for what we've done for a few examples of things that we know contain substance data. And then we could create the pattern and now use this pattern writ large to multiple other data sets. So when we do this mapping, we're going to see that there's 3 different levels of sophistication or 3 different mapping type of requirements that are going to be involved to help us take the data that's currently in the relational form and convert it into this kind of rich semantic format. The first step or the first level is going to be what we call class and property classification. So for example, if I gave you a table, can you infer what type of class is being described in this table? And by the way, can you infer which properties are linked to each column of a table? Okay, so for example, I give you a table and you come back and say, hey, this table contains substance and moiety information. The next level of sophistication is going to be to create labels or tags at the record level itself. And we're going to look at a couple of examples, but the level 2 is where we want to be able to either harmonize inconsistent information that's associated to constraints that have been described in our model, where we did have valid values or an enumerated list of values, or we want to be able to impute missing information based on looking at our understanding of that specific property or class. Okay. And our goal or our trick here is going to be to try to do this without creating static mapping tables or kind of typical reference lookup tables. And we'll talk about why in a second. The final level of mapping that's required in order to convert the relational data to a semantic form is going to be this IRI linkage. And what we mean here is that we're going to find lots of duplicate information or possibly even enriched information about the same entity in multiple different data sources. And we're going to need to have a systematic process for going through and saying, hey, I just noticed that we're talking about substance information in 2 different database tables or 2 different database sources, but one system has a unique ID for this substance, and the same exact substance has a completely different ID in a different database source. And we need to be able to programmatically connect the dots and link it together. So these are the 3 different steps that we're going to have to undertake if we want to complete a proper mapping of structured data to our semantic model. Let's go through each one at a time and let's take a look at what's actually going on under the covers. The very first level of mapping is class and property level classification. And this is kind of going back to our original example. This is creating the context around what information is this data table trying to convey by using or linking it to the various different concepts in our ontology. So for example, we could teach a machine learning model that this table is specifically describing a substance. And we've explicitly defined a substance as meaning something very specific and having a specific unique ID. So one thing that we could do is we could say, great, this table can be linked to the IRI or the unique ID for this term in my ontology called substance. And by the way, this specific column, well, this could be correlated to the moiety identifier, which was a different concept or a different IRI in my model. And this is the name, and this is the smiles value, and we can keep going. Okay, so this will be kind of the first level of classification, which is teaching machines how to go through and how to start tagging each individual column or tag a data table to a term for my ontology and then link and connect the ID of that term to either the table or the column name. The next level of classification is when we go beyond just looking at the data table name or the column name, and we're going one level deep and we're going into the record itself. So just to give an example, in our ontology, we described the concept called a substance type, and we said that every substance must have a substance type. And we further created a constraint that said that a substance type must be one of 7 specific values. And then you can see here what the various different values are. But the key element is that these values mean something very specific. So as we've discussed before, if I tag something as a nucleic acid, there's a lot of inferable knowledge that we can then bring to the table because we know what the term nucleic acid means, because that's explicitly described in our ontology. So the next level, level 2 mapping, is when we're able to teach machines how to read the properties. Now that we know that something is a substance, can we read the properties of a substance class? And then for each instance of that substance, help identify and teach the machine how to find the patterns to determine whether something is a chemical or a mixture or nucleic acid, etc. And so being able to create a record, a label or a tag at the record level is what we call level 2. In a traditional data management world, this used to be called reference data management, where each of these different values were typically considered reference data values. And historically, we used to have reference data mapping tables. In this new world, we want to stay away from having static mapping tables, and we want to have a more dynamic process for discovery that can say, if I know that something is a substance, I can teach the model to say that based on looking at properties of a substance, looking at the name, the Smiles value, maybe the moiety identifier, somewhere in there we may have clues that may help me identify how to now describe the substance type. The third level is when we start to connect information from across multiple different data sources to link them together around a common IRI or link them to the common ID. In this example, I have data from one database table here, and I have data from a completely different database table over here. And what we want to do is we want to be able to say, if we can deduce or infer that both of these tables contain substance information, and we can further deduce that this specific record in the first table is describing the same instance of a substance as the second to last record of the second table below it, then we can start to teach machines how to connect the dots and link all of these different IDs from each of the different sources to the IRI, to the one international resource identifier. And then what this will allow us to do is this will allow us to now start taking the knowledge from across multiple different database tables, and it will allow us to bring it together, and we can further teach the machine how to not only connect information, but look for areas where there's conflicting information and try to resolve the conflicts. In the traditional data world, this used to be kind of called master data management. And in essence, what we're advocating for is master data management for every subject in your ontology. It's almost kind of like master data management on steroids, but using your semantic ontology as the way to describe the things that are being mastered, as well as using the properties of your semantic ontology to help you describe the matching and the merging logic. So when we run through these 3 steps, that's how we're going to actually wind up converting structured data and discovering all of the relationships and links to IRIs that will allow us to start to convert the data into a rich semantic format. Now we could do the same exact thing for unstructured data. So if you look at step 2b, here we're going to go through a slightly different process, but one again that's machine assisted, where we're going to be able to take audio, video, documents, PDFs, Word files, go through a process of discovery, parse the information into text, then apply various different artificial intelligence algorithms, whether they're transformers, again, large language models comes into play. But the goal is to start connecting the various different ideas or concepts that are being described in the audio or the video or the text file we want to be able to do the same thing and start linking them to terms in our ontology and linking the IRIs to the various different tokens that appear in our different unstructured data sets. And as we do this, we can then further kind of go back and start making recommendations or candidates to go back and refine our ontologies even further. Just to give an example of what this looks like, we have here a document, and within this document, what we can do is we can start having the machine start color coding and tagging different components or elements of the document, different tokens, and then trying to associate these terms inside my document to the instances of terms that were described in my ontologies. And ultimately, the goal is to be able to say, I can connect multiple IRIs to this document. And when I do this, I've now inherited a lot of really rich information into this document. Once we're complete with step number 2, we can now go into step number 3. And step number 3 is when we're going to use a knowledge graph to connect and link all this information together. And as we're bringing the data together, here's where we can actually now start to define our data contracts or our access policies using the semantic model so that we can also further control who is allowed to see what. Now, for the structured data, what we can do is we can take the information that has been discovered and we can either convert the data into a rich semantic format. So we use JSON linked data as a way to describe or convert structured data very easily into a semantic data set that can be easily understood by large language models or other systems that know how to read and understand semantic data. Or you can take the metadata, the mappings, and save it in a slightly different format using something called R2RML. R2RML, or RDB to RDF mapping language, is a way to programmatically save the mappings such that any system that knows how to read R2RML and how to execute the programming logic in R2RML is able to query the information at the source in a federated way without having to physically bring all the data in one place. So what we can do is we can either take data from our structured data sources and convert parts of it and bring the data itself into the graph. Or we can just take the mapping instructions and the mapping logic and bring the mapping logic into the graph. And then when we ask a question in our knowledge graph, we can either have the answers natively in it, or we can have the instructions for how to go and fetch the data from the source. And in many organizations, there's going to be a mix of, in some cases, just bring the metadata in and use the mappings. In some cases, bring all of the data in. We're going to go through some of those examples before we finish our discussion. We can also do the same exact thing for our unstructured data, which is bring the data, convert it to RDF, or the resource definition framework, and then bring that into the knowledge graph. And now we can ask questions inside our semantic knowledge graph. We can write queries. We should now be able to retrieve information, whether the information was originally in a document, a video, a database table. And this is how we'll be able to now connect the information for our regulatory submission use case. The fourth and the final step is then to expand, right? So we originally started with just substances and the things that were immediately adjacent to defining and describing a substance. And now we can expand this to a brand new term and a brand new domain. And now we're going to start talking about medicinal products. And then medicinal products itself will have its own properties and its own set of classes that it's interconnected to. But then we can rinse and repeat the same process. I have new terms in my ontology. I'm going to go back and I'm going to train the machine learning models how to map structured and unstructured data. I'm going to then link and connect the new IRI relationships that have been discovered to my graph. And then I'm going to keep going. I'm going to expand my model one more time. And this way we can kind of iterate through, start very small, very piecemeal, but keep working our way bit by bit to the point that we now start rolling in multiple ontologies, multiple large ontologies, small ontologies, etc. The reason why we like this model, map, and connect framework is it's very use case specific. It allows you to derive some quick wins without losing sight of the big picture at the end. It is a very kind of future-proofed process so that if we change the ontology, if we add new terms to our ontology, it's very easy for us to extend and reuse a lot of the work that we've already put into it. And as you mentioned, it is mission critical for some of these new use cases that depend on passing information in a rich semantic way to agents that know how to read this data. So large language models, for example, natively understand and know how to read information in graphs, and they also understand and natively understand the rich JSON LD format. And so if we care about generative AI use cases, then it's almost an imperative to use this workflow to get data into that rich format. Now, within Fluree, we've kind of organized our capabilities and our products around this idea of model, map, and connect. So from a modeling perspective, we have an application, or we have a solution called the Intelligent Taxonomy Manager. And the Intelligent Taxonomy Manager is the tool that you use to kind of build, describe, and create your models. And then we have a set of mapping software. So we have one solution called Fluree Sense. Fluree Sense is focused on how do we automate the mapping to structured data. And we have another solution that we called CAM, or the Content Auto Tagging Manager. And that's the solution that we use to map the unstructured data to the model. And then finally, we can connect everything with our Fluree database itself. So our Fluree core is a semantic graph database, and it allows you to set the policies and set the access permissions and contracts programmatically by using the model. And then once the data is inside the Fluree database, we've now activated it for lots of use cases. Let's go in and let's take a look at model, map, and connect in action. The very first step is to model. And in this case, Fluree has the Intelligent Taxonomy Manager software, which allows teams to collaboratively define their classes, properties, the constraints within the properties and classes, and the relationships across and between them. Here is the Intelligent Taxonomy Management software. As you can see here, the interface allows you to manage one or more taxonomies or ontologies across your organization. And across these different taxonomies, you'll have various different classes, and then you may have even instances of those classes. So let's look at a specific graph-based view. In this case, we're going to look at the class called person. And in this case, from the graph, we'll be able to see that a person has certain properties. And so we can define what are the properties, the object properties of this class called person. But then also see that a person has a relationship via an employment role to an organization. And then a person may have a skill, and a skill is a different class, and then this class has its own properties. And so this is just a visual way of navigating a business ontology or a model. What's really critical is that not only can we go in and define the model, but we can then manage the information itself within the model. So let's say in this case, we've defined a person, and we said that a person is a type of agent, and we're going to give a unique ID to that specific concept or this class called a person. And then a person will have different properties. So a person has a name, it has an identifier, it has a skill, and it could be an expert in something. And then we have associations. And in here, we can say that a person has an employment relationship with an organization. And then if we can go in, we can actually go into more details and say, now when we go in and we said that a person has a skill, we can define a unique ID for the class of a skill, and then have a unique ID for each instance of a skill. So in this case, we're saying that active listening is a skill, and this active listening skill has its own unique ID. Now, critically, as we start mapping the data, what the system is going to do is the system is going to discover potential new candidates. And candidates are new potential concepts or instances of classes that the system has discovered by analyzing and scanning data. And this is typically what's done through the second step, which is our map step. In our map step, we have two different applications. There's one application which focuses on mapping structured data and one for unstructured data. For structured data, we're going to take a look at our Fluree application. And what Fluree allows you to do is it allows you to overlay or map one or more different ontologies to structured data tables, basically database tables or things that we would expect to see in a spreadsheet. And we can also go one level deeper and enrich and classify at the record level, as well as link and connect different types of information from across multiple databases to the same type of class or entity. This is the Fluree interface. And within the Fluree interface, here we will have brought in several different ontologies or models. And from here, users can take the models which could have been imported from the Intelligent Taxonomy Manager or any other modeling tool. And then we kind of go ahead and take a little bit of a deeper dive and take a look at it and say, here we've got different classes. And then within each of the classes, we have the properties that represent the classes. So this is just a tabular view of the same model information that we looked at within ITM. And the goal is going to be to take data. So in this case, we've mapped data from many different data sources, including our ERP system, our financial reporting system, our product marketing database. So we've brought in data from lots of different sources. But ultimately, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to take information that is structured, meaning it's in this tabular format, and we want to be able to overlay the various different ontologies or business models onto the data very quickly. And so ultimately, one of the goals will be to automatically have the system start generating these visual graphs. And so this is a graph that is displaying the relationship that says this specific table could be described in one or more ontologies. In this ontology, the IDMP, you could use the substance identification class and map various database columns to various different properties within this class. Or we could use this ontology, the Gen Pharma catalog. And in this Gen Pharma catalog, there are properties of the data that could be linked to a pharmaceutical product class, or a substance class, or medicinal product. And again, we can also connect the information to this GSRS ontology where we describe substances and structures. Now, the way that this is generated is through the AI or machine learning, where we're going through individual columns. And so we'll take this specific column. And for each column, we'll define by using its data profile, we'll study the metadata and the data and generate a unique feature vector or signature for this column. And once we have these feature vectors, we can then start to train the machine learning models to go through and identify what are the possible different concepts that map or correlate to that feature vector. And then we can have different subject matter experts across the company agree or disagree. And then we can keep a rolling tally or tab of who voted to say that they agreed that this specific column is correlated to that specific concept. So this is an example of being able to do that first level classification, which is to be able to take database tables and map database tables to potential classes, as well as map individual columns to corresponding potential concepts. Now, one level deeper than being able to tag the table and the column is to go to each individual record itself and then add additional classifiers or impute additional information based on being able to study the contents of each record. In this case, what we're going to do is we basically have, as part of our ontology, the ability to define a substance type and say, if I know that something is a substance, then I could tag that record to one of these 7 unique different types of substances. And in this case, we have identified that we have a concept called a substance type, and we want to be able to study and introspect the contents of a record and determine whether that record is a chemical, or if it's a protein, or a mixture. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a classification project. in that classification project, we're going to try to tag a record to the IDMP substance type. And in this case, we've generated a very quick machine learning model that's at a current level of confidence. You can see the confidence level here. And the goal is ultimately to teach the model to get to a level where it's about 80 to 90% confident that it knows how to scan, read the contents of the record, and be able to come up with the appropriate classification. Let's actually take a look at the results. I actually have the results here. And so when we look at the results, in that sense, for each record, the machine is going to try to read the contents and then try to make a prediction what is the appropriate IDMP substance type that we can classify or tag to this record. So the system in this case is 100% confident that this specific substance is a protein, but it's less confident on what to do with this specific record. Or if we take a look at this record, this could either be considered a chemical or this could be a nucleic acid. The idea here is that a subject matter expert would go in and say, look, it's either a chemical or a nucleic acid, and I can give thumbs up to one. Or I could give thumbs down, and if we give thumbs down, then we can give additional information and say, well, if it's neither one of these, then what else could it be? And ultimately, by doing this, we're going to teach the machine to get smarter. And a structured way to do this is to go through a formal training process, where in a training process, the system will automatically generate a series of tasks. And then these tasks could be assigned to different subject matter experts in the company. And then the subject matter experts will be able to go in and they'll be able to go through it and start making specific recommendations. So let's say in this case, we have this specific substance. We don't know what it is. We know it's neither polymer nor structurally diverse. So what we could do is we could either pick an option, or what we could do is we could say, if none of the options are here really describe what this is, we can add a brand new class name. So let's create this and call this new substance type. And we'll add this as an option. And now what we've done is we've now created a brand new candidate term. And this candidate term is something that would then appear back on our ontology manager so that we can go back and say, look, do we want to include and formally ratify the introduction of that brand new classifier into our ontology? So let's finish this task. Great. So as we go through this process, ultimately the goal will be that once we've enriched the data with all the necessary information, we'll then be able to click on this button, export the data as a graph, and now we've converted all of this tabular information into this rich semantic form. And in a couple minutes, we'll take a look at what that actually looks like once we finish the conversion. So this is an example of kind of going through the mapping for structured data. We can also do something similar for unstructured data. And in unstructured data, what we're looking to is we're looking to take in documents. These could be PDF documents. These could be audio files, video files. But we want to run through a similar process, which is, can we actually scan the contents of the unstructured information? And can we do a similar process, link it, and connect it to our ontological terms? Let's do a quick demo and take a look at what that looks like. In this scenario, we're going to take a look at a health ontology. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to pick from a couple of different articles that have been preset. And so we have this specific set of text. And what we're going to do is we're just going to run our content auto tagging manager. And so what this is going to do is it's going to start to describe what are the key classes from an ontology that were present in the information. And then we can see here how it's describing the information based on relevance and frequency. And so if we take a look here, we can see how it's individually tagged specific terms to various different concepts within our ontology. Again, as we discussed, each of these different ontologies, each of these different terms has a unique IRI. And that's how we'll be able to start tagging the IRIs back to the individual documents. In addition to describing specific terms in the ontology, It can also identify new candidates. So in this case, it's going to recommend that we have this new term, and this new term should be added as a candidate because this wasn't in our ontology before. And then we can have our experts go through, validate, and choose to agree or disagree whether to add this to the ontology. And if we do, then we would generate a unique IRI for that specific term itself. So this is an example of how we're also running through a mapping process for unstructured data. But again, this has a series of machine learning algorithms that are running under the covers. Now, once we've done this mapping activity, we can now take this information and bring it into our knowledge graph. And in this case, we're going to load the data into Fluree Core, which is our knowledge graph application. So this is our Fluree Core interface, and this is our cloud-based version. We have versions that run on-prem as well as on the cloud. And so if we come here, we'll be able to take a look at a series of different data sets that I have access to from within my login or my credentials. And we're going to take a look at our GSRS data. So this is the same substance data that we previously had inside our database table, but now it's been loaded into the graph. Now let's take a look at some of the interesting and unique properties and things that we can do with the information once it's in the graph. So first things first is I'm just going to pull up this notebook. And this notebook is going to walk us through a little bit of the behind the scenes process for how easily we converted the structured data that we had in our database tables and how we brought it into the graph and what were some of the benefits of bringing it into the graph. So first thing is we're going to first load and bring into our graph database the actual ontology or the vocabulary file. In this case, what we're seeing here is we have a specific ontology called GSRS. It was describing a thing called the substance. And then we have here the names of the properties and the descriptions of it. So we're going to bring all the business metadata, all of our ontology information, our classes and properties, and the IRIs. We're going to take it, we're going to import it, and we're going to transact this, or basically import this into our graph database. The second step is then we're going to take the data itself, and we're also going to bring the data and transact it into the knowledge graph. Now, our knowledge graph database is using a document format called JSON LD. And in Fluree Sense, when we clicked on the button to export the graph, it automatically created this JSON LD document for the data that was introspecting. So in this case, we're looking at the GSRS substance data, and you can see here how we're basically instructing it to insert these JSON objects into our database. And so we'll just go ahead, and under the covers, we've now inserted this specific set of information into our knowledge graph. Now, once the data is inside our knowledge graph, we can now generate Sparkle, or in this case, we're going to look at Fluree QL, but we can generate queries to look for and ask for information. In this case, we're looking for, this is the equivalent of kind of a select star query in a SQL database. We're just looking for any instance of a substance that has a UUID. And the system has come back and it's generated the set of JSON objects that we loaded in the beginning. Now what we can do is we can actually load another ontology or a second vocabulary and bring this into our graph. So when we were looking at the information from the Fluree Sense screen, we saw that the same database table could be described using multiple vocabularies or multiple ontologies. So what we're going to do is we're going to load one of the other ontologies, in this case, the identification of medicinal products ontology, and we're going to load and bring this one into the graph. So same thing, we're going to bring in the descriptive, the business metadata, the contextual information, and we're going to transact and bring this into our knowledge graph. Now, one of the other things that happened through the machine learning mapping process is that the system discovered automatically relationships between and across multiple ontologies. So, for example, what GSRS, this property called approval ID from this substance in this ontology, is actually equivalent to a substance code from IDMP. Or what GSRS calls a UUID is what IDMP calls the moiety identifier. And we're seeing how we're using this equivalent property here to describe in systematic fashion how we can use either term to relate to the same type of data, even though they have different names. And the reason why this is valuable is that we can now go to the final cell here, and we can actually query the same information that we previously loaded. But instead of using the GSRS vocabulary, now we can change the vocabulary and query the same data but using a different vocabulary. Now I can query the data by saying, get me any substance that has a moiety identifier. And if I query the data set, I will now get back my response that, again, it's another way of retrieving the information. But now I can query the data using a vocabulary that I'm more comfortable with. And again, that's one of the benefits of the values of being able to bring the data into the graph. So hopefully this gives you kind of a quick overview of how we use the suite of Fluree technology to be able to build your model, map structured and unstructured data into the model, which converts the data into JSON LD or RDF. And then we can bring the JSON LD into our Fluree core database to be able to transact it. And we can also set policies and provide governance and control so that we can share the information safely with other members of the team. So now that we've discussed the framework, model, map, and connect, we've walked through a use case example of how this works in the pharmaceutical industry. And we further kind of walk through and discuss how our various different products are designed and organized around this framework. Now we can kind of get into discussions of, well, how should we get started within the organization? And what I'm demonstrating or showing here in this screen is the typical path that we've seen in many organizations that are starting to create and move from the relational world into the semantic world. And typically, the very first step, or kind of what we say the crawl step in the framework, is to start very safely just using metadata. In this case, what we're doing is we're building kind of a semantic data catalog or a data marketplace. And the objective, the business goal here, is just to get your arms around what information exists in the company and who owns it, so that if I want to, I can go and ask and request to get access to it. In this step, all we're doing is we're just modeling and mapping just metadata. So we're just going to go through and we're going to say we have these many systems that are out there. These systems have various different technical schemas and table names and columns. We're going to describe everything and save everything as links and connections to specific terms in my ontology. And then we're going to expose this meta information, or the stitching between the business metadata and the technical metadata. We're going to expose that in our graph. And that's kind of the safe way that many organizations get started. The next step, or level 2, which is kind of the walk step, is where we're going to start to bring in data, but only certain facets of data. Maybe we're just going to bring in data assets that need to be mastered. So we're just going to bring in customer data, product data, account data, transaction data, certain things that require integrating them, merging them from multiple different sources to create golden sources of truth. And what we'll do is we'll go through the workflow that we just described with entity IRI linkage. We go through the workflow, we create new data products, and then we bring those data products as well as the workflows for how they get created, we bring those into the graph. And so now you're going to have metadata that's going to contain the mappings to all the originating sources of data. But then you're going to use your knowledge graph as the authoritative source of truth for certain classes of information, which is your mastered data. The final step, or run, is when you've set up kind of a full enterprise data fabric and you've either defined all of your R2 RML mappings and you have all of your data assets and your data products in the graph. And now you're able to go and use the knowledge graph as a way to go and interrogate all the underlying source systems. And this is kind of like the final nirvana state. And this is where, once you reach kind of step number 3, this is where you can feel confident that you have a well enough structured, cleansed, integrated data architecture that we can now point various different teams, whether they're teams inside your company or outside of your company, partners, and large language models can now access this resource. And we can describe very robust access control policies to make sure that we limit and control what the various different team members, what the various different intelligent agents can see so that they can execute the use cases. So just to quickly close out, we've discussed that the new use cases of the future as it relates to data are really focused on the theme of different teams and different machines using data beyond the initial scope or purpose for which it was created. Meaning the data has to be reused outside of the original schema of the application of the business process that created it. In order to do that, we need to move away from lots of technical, physical schema management and really move towards more semantic, logical modeling. And then use some of these frameworks like model, map, and connect to help us take the 30 years worth of data that's been created in these relational forms, but now overlay the semantics on top of it without physically having to change or remove all of it, but just physically changing and moving elements of it, the data that needs to be integrated and cleansed. Use that to clean and integrate data and then have it available in your knowledge graph. And we've also described how the Fluree product suite really helps and supports this journey. So we would love for you to get started along this journey. If you have any questions or comments based on this talk track, please feel free. You can see my email address here. Please feel free to reach out and send an email. We'd also love for you to try our free sandbox just to kind of get up to date and up to speed on how a knowledge graph works and operates. So please, it's a free sign up. Please feel free to go into data.flur.ee. In there, you can just create a quick account. Once you sign up an account, you can immediately get access to our knowledge graph, and you can kind of go ahead and follow some of the instructions and some of the notebooks that are there to get started right away on your semantic journey. Thank you very much. We hope you found this discussion track informative, and we'd love to hear from you as you go through yourself on a semantic journey.